The groan of the wheels was the first thing to die. For 3 days. It had been a constant companion, a low, grinding moan that had worked its way into Delilah Hart's bones until she felt she might carry the sound with her forever. It ceased with a final, shuddering sigh, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against her ears. Then came the jangle of harnesses, the snort of a tired horse, and the driver's gruff voice calling out, "Dust Pine, end of the line." Delilah didn't move at first. She sat pressed against the worn leather of the stagecoach wall, her gloved fingers laced together in her lap, watching the dust motes dance in the sliver of late afternoon sun that sliced through the window. The other passengers, a portly salesman with a sweat-stained collar and a young family of 4 who had huddled together in weary silence since Wichita, were already stirring. The salesman grunted as he heaved his sample case, the mother quietly shushing her fretful child. They were moving on to something known, to faces they expected to see. Delilah was moving into a void. Her own breath felt shallow in her chest. She forced herself to take a deeper one, tasting the grit of the trail on the back of her tongue. Hope, she had discovered, was a fragile thing. It had felt so strong back in Missouri. A defiant flame ignited by a few lines of stark black print in a 2-week-old newspaper. Wanted, the advertisement had read, housekeeper for cattle ranch. Honest work, fair wage, sober and reliable character essential. Inquire at the Red Mesa Ranch. Dust Pine. Every word had seemed a lifeline. Honest work, a chance to wash away the stain of dishonest assumptions. Fair wage, the means to be beholden to no one but herself. Sober and reliable, a description of the woman she was determined to become, not the one she had been accused of being. Dust Pine. The name itself had sounded like a promise, a place where the past could be ground to a fine powder and blown away by the ceaseless prairie wind. Now, peering through the grimy window, the reality of it began to set in. Dust Pine was aptly named. It wasn't a town so much as a raw wound on the face of the earth, a collection of unpainted, clapboard buildings huddled along a wide, rutted street that was more dust than dirt. A saloon with swinging doors stood opposite a general store whose windows were so clouded with grime they looked opaque. Further down, the dark maw of a livery stable gaped open, and the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed with a lonely, metallic finality. There were no trees to soften the harsh lines, no gardens to offer a splash of color. It was a place built for purpose, not for comfort. The stagecoach door swung open with a shriek of protesting hinges, and the driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, peered in. "This is it for you, miss," he said, his tone devoid of anything but impatience. Delilah nodded, her throat too tight to form a word. She gathered the worn handles of her suitcase. It wasn't large, but it held everything she owned in the world: 2 simple calico dresses, a change of underthings, her mother's well-worn Bible, a small tin of salve for her hands, and the newspaper clipping that had become her talisman. The leather was scuffed and scarred, a testament to journeys made and doors closed. One of the straps had broken outside of Dodge City, and she had mended it with a piece of twine, the knot a clumsy, visible reminder of her own frayed circumstances. She moved toward the door, her limbs stiff and aching from the relentless jostling of the coach. The salesman was already on the ground, stretching his back. The family was being met by a man with a wide smile and open arms, and the sight sent a sharp, unexpected pang through Delilah's chest. She turned away, focusing on the 3 steep steps to the ground. She placed her worn boot on the first step, her hand gripping the hot iron rail for balance. The sun was low in the sky, a searing orange ball that bled across the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that made the town seem even more skeletal and unwelcoming. Her feet touched the ground of Dust Pine. The dust was fine and soft, puffing up around the hem of her gray traveling dress. The driver unceremoniously dropped her suitcase beside her with a thud that sent up another small cloud. He tipped his hat, a gesture that held no courtesy, and climbed back onto his perch. With a crack of his whip and a jangle of leather and brass, the stagecoach lurched forward, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the street. She stood perfectly still, the sole of her shoe feeling the faint vibration of the departing wheels. The sound faded, swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. And then there was only the wind, a low, mournful whisper that stirred the dust around her ankles and pulled at the loose strands of hair that had escaped her severe bun. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum against her ribs, slowed to a heavy, doubtful thud. This was it, the new beginning. It felt terrifyingly like an ending. No one came forward. No one smiled. A few men loitering on the porch of the saloon turned to look at her. Their gazes were not curious, but assessing, weighing her worth and her purpose with a blunt, frontier practicality. She saw the flicker of speculation in their eyes and felt a familiar, hot shame rise in her cheeks. She immediately lowered her gaze to her suitcase, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. She was a woman, alone, arriving on the late coach with a single bag. She knew what conclusions they were drawing. It was a story she had run from all the way from Missouri, only to find its shadow waiting for her here. A woman emerged from the general store, a burlap sack slung over her shoulder. She glanced at Delilah, her expression flat and unreadable, before turning and walking down a side street without a word. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. In the sudden quiet, Delilah could hear the tinny, out-of-tune notes of a piano starting up inside the saloon. The sound was jaunty and hollow, a mockery of the profound solitude that enveloped her. This was the first test, she knew. To stand here and be stared at, to be judged and dismissed before she'd even spoken a word. The old Delilah might have faltered. She might have let the tears that pricked the back of her eyes fall. She might have looked for the next stage out, no matter where it was going. But that Delilah had made too many bad choices. She had trusted the wrong smiles and believed the wrong promises. She had allowed a man's gambling debts and smooth lies to paint her as something she wasn't, costing her a respectable job as a governess and the only home she had. The shame of it had been a physical weight, pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. But shame was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had spent her last dollar on the ticket that brought her here. There was no going back. There was only forward, into the long shadows of this dusty, silent town. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and lifted her chin. She would not let them see her fear. She picked up her suitcase, the mended strap digging into her palm. Her gaze swept across the street, looking for someone, anyone, who did not look at her as if she were a piece of meat on a hook. Her eyes settled on the livery stable. A boy, perhaps 16 years of age, was pitching hay from a loft. He was wiry and moved with an easy economy of motion. He seemed too busy to be interested in her. He was her best chance. She crossed the street, her boots sinking into the deep dust. Each step felt deliberate. A small act of defiance against the crushing weight of the silence. The smell of horses, hay, and manure grew stronger, a strangely comforting scent that spoke of work and life. As she reached the wide entrance of the stable, the boy paused, leaning on his pitchfork and wiping a forearm across his sweaty brow. He watched her approach with the same impassive curiosity as the others, but there was no malice in it. "Excuse me," Delilah said, her voice sounding hoarse and unfamiliar to her own ears. The boy just stared. "I'm looking for the Red Mesa Ranch," she tried again, forcing a steadiness into her tone. "I was told to inquire here for a housekeeping position." He blinked slowly, as if processing a foreign language. Then, he pointed a thumb over his shoulder, out past the edge of town toward the vast, open country where the land began to rise in a series of ruddy, flat-topped hills. "Red Mesa's out that way," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Good 5-mile walk. McAllister don't come to town much. 5 miles. The sun was already touching the horizon. A cold knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. Was no one sent to meet the stage, she asked, the hope in her voice sounding thin and childish, even to her. The boy shrugged, a gesture of complete indifference. Don't know nothing about that, just know where the ranch is. He turned back to his hay, the conversation clearly over. Delilah stood for a moment, the finality of his dismissal washing over her. Of course, no one had come. Why would they? She was just a name in an application letter, a potential solution to a problem. Her comfort, her safe arrival, was of no concern. This was the West. You arrived, you survived, or you didn't. She looked down the road that led out of town. It was little more than a set of wagon ruts fading into the twilight, a 5-mile walk, with her suitcase into a land she did not know, to meet a man she had never seen. It was another choice, laid bare before her, a daunting, perhaps foolish one, but it was the only one she had. She gave the boy a small, stiff nod that he didn't see, and turned her back on the town of Dust Pine. She adjusted her grip on the heavy suitcase, her palm already aching, as she took her first step onto that long, lonely road. The last rays of the sun set the red mesas in the distance ablaze with a fiery, impossible color. It was a beautiful, terrible sight, full of a wild and unforgiving promise. It wasn't a welcome. It was a challenge. And for the first time in a very long time, Delilah Hart felt the faintest, stubborn flicker of a response rise within her. She would meet it. She had to. The road was not a road. It was a suggestion, a ghost of a path that dissolved into the deepening twilight. The vibrant, fiery colors of the mesas had cooled to bruised purples and deep indigos, their shapes hulking against a sky pricked with the first, impossibly bright stars. The wind had picked up, no longer a whisper, but a steady, insistent push that carried the chill of the high plains. It snaked under the collar of Delilah's dress and made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. With every step, the town of Dust Pine shrank behind her, its few scattered lights becoming faint, flickering promises of a warmth she had not been offered. She walked on, her world shrinking to the rhythm of her own weary footsteps and the rasp of her breathing. The suitcase was a leaden weight, a cruel anchor pulling at her shoulder socket. She switched hands every 100 paces, the temporary relief quickly giving way to the same burning ache. The twine she had used to mend the strap was rough, and she could feel it rubbing the skin of her palm raw through her thin glove. After what felt like an hour, but could have been only 20 minutes, she had to stop. She lowered the suitcase to the ground, its thud startlingly loud in the immense quiet. She flexed her aching fingers, her arms trembling with the strain. The silence that rushed in was absolute, broken only by the cry of a distant coyote, a sound of such profound loneliness it felt like an echo of her own heart. A tremor of fear, cold and sharp, ran through her. She was a woman alone, miles from any soul, in a wilderness that did not know or care for her existence. It would be so easy to simply sit down beside her suitcase, to curl into a ball and let the cold and the darkness take her. But the thought was a fleeting one, burned away by the memory of condescending eyes in Missouri, of whispers that followed her down the street, of a door closing firmly in her face. That was a kind of death, too, a slow erosion of the soul. This aching body, this biting wind, this terrifying emptiness was at least a sign of life. It was the price of moving forward. She took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, pushed a stray wisp of hair from her face, and picked up the suitcase again. She began to measure her progress not in miles, but in landmarks that existed only in the dim starlight, from one dark clump of sagebrush to the next, past the skeletal remains of a lightning-scarred cottonwood, toward a rise in the land that promised a better view of what lay ahead. Her feet found a rhythm born of pure necessity. The initial panic subsided, replaced by a grim, focused determination. Her mind went blessedly blank. Her thoughts stripped down to the immediate task: left foot, right foot, swing the suitcase, breathe. The landscape unfolded around her in monochrome, a world of silvered earth and black shadows. She was a small, solitary figure moving through an enormous, sleeping land. It was the smell that reached her first, faintly at first, then stronger on the windwood smoke, the rich scent of cattle, and the faint, not unpleasant aroma of hay and leather. A dog barked, a sharp, territorial sound that was quickly followed by a man's low command to be quiet. Delilah froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She had arrived. Peering into the darkness, she could now make out the dark, angular shapes of buildings clustered ahead. A large barn, several long, low sheds, and a solid-looking house from which a single yellow light glowed in a downstairs window. It wasn't a beacon of welcome, but a simple statement of fact: someone was home. Her exhaustion seemed to double with the end of her journey in sight. Every muscle screamed in protest as she forced herself to cover the last few hundred yards. The ground became firm and well-trodden under her feet as she entered the ranch yard. The house was larger up close, built from thick, dark timbers and river stone, with a wide porch running its length. It looked sturdy, unadorned, and permanent, as if it had grown from the land itself. She set her suitcase down at the bottom of the 3 porch steps, the sound echoing in the still night air. For a long moment, she simply stood there, trying to compose herself. She knew what she must look like. Her dress was coated in a fine layer of dust. Her hair was a mess, and she felt a grime on her skin that was more than just trail dirt. She was a stray, appearing at a stranger's door after dark. She took off her gloves, tucked them into her pocket, and tried to smooth her dress and pat her hair into some semblance of order. It was a futile gesture, but it was all she could do. Finally, she climbed the steps, her boots making a hollow, definitive sound on the wooden planks. She walked to the solid oak door and raised her hand to knock. Her knuckles hovered for a second, trembling slightly. This was the moment, the culmination of a desperate hope and a 1,000-mile journey. She knocked 3 times, the sound loud and final. She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. She could hear movement inside, the scrape of a chair, then the heavy tread of boots approaching the door. A bolt was drawn back with a sharp, metallic click, and the door swung inward. The man who stood there filled the entire frame. The lamplight from behind him cast him in silhouette, making him seem impossibly large, a creature of shadow and substance. He was tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to strain the fabric of his simple work shirt. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, one hand resting on the doorframe, looking down at her. Delilah had to crane her neck to meet his gaze. As her eyes adjusted to the light spilling from the doorway, she could see his face. It was a hard face, not cruel, but carved from the same unforgiving elements as the land around them. His jaw was square and dark with stubble. His mouth a firm, straight line. Lines were etched at the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting into an unrelenting sun. His dark hair was cut short, and his eyes, in the flickering light, were a deep, unreadable shade. He was, she realized with a jolt, the owner of this place. This was Boone McAllister, and he was not a man who offered warm welcomes. His silence stretched, becoming a palpable force. He was waiting for her to speak, to justify her presence on his porch. Delilah swallowed, the sound loud in her own ears. "Mr. McAllister," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Delilah Hart. I wrote to you from Missouri, about the housekeeper position." He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. His gaze swept over her, from her disheveled hair to the dusty hem of her dress and the worn-out boots on her feet. It was not a lecherous look, but something far more unnerving. It was an appraisal, as blunt and thorough as a rancher judging livestock. He was assessing her for strength, for durability, for any sign of weakness that would make her unfit for the work. She felt herself flush under the intensity of his scrutiny, but forced herself to hold his gaze. Without a word, he stepped back, holding the door open just enough for her to pass. It was not an invitation, merely a concession. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping over the threshold into the house. The room was large and sparsely furnished. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. The logs within burned down to glowing embers. A long table of heavy dark wood was flanked by several simple chairs. A rifle rested on pegs above the mantelpiece. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. It was a man's space, clean and orderly but devoid of any softness. Boone McAllister closed the door behind her, the sound shutting out the night and enclosing them in the tense silence of the room. He walked past her to the table without looking at her. On a peg near the fireplace hung several coats and a pair of well-worn leather work gloves. He took the gloves from the peg and tossed them onto the table. They landed with a soft, final thud between them. He looked at her then, his eyes clear and direct. "It's not pleasant work," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges like worn saddle leather. It wasn't a question or a warning. It was a fact. He was laying the truth of the job bare, daring her to retreat. Delilah looked from his hard, unsmiling face to the gloves on the table. They were stiff, stained with work and sweat. They represented everything she was facing: endless scrubbing, harsh lye soap, laundry in freezing water, floors that would never stay clean, and the relentless, back-breaking labor of keeping a ranch house from surrendering to the elements. It was a life stripped of all pretense. She thought of the false pleasantries in Missouri, the polite smiles that hid cutting judgments, the delicate teacups and the suffocating propriety of a life that had turned out to be a lie. She had had enough of pleasant. Pleasant was a veneer, a thin and brittle layer over a core of deceit. What she craved now was something solid, something that would not shatter when she put her weight on it. She met his gaze, her own chin lifting slightly. "I don't need pleasant," she said, her voice quiet but firm, resonating with the truth she had earned on the long road to this room. "I need real." Something shifted in his eyes. It was not a softening, not a flicker of sympathy or kindness. It was sharper than that, more immediate. It was a spark of recognition, a brief, unguarded moment where his stony facade seemed to crack just enough to reveal something underneath. It was the look of a man who understood the distinction she had made, who lived his own life by that same hard principle. He had expected a complaint, an excuse, a plea for leniency from a tired woman who had just walked 5 miles in the dark. He had not expected an answer that mirrored his own soul. He looked at her, and, for the first time, it felt as though he was not just seeing a potential housekeeper, but a person. He didn't smile. The firm line of his mouth didn't move, but the recognition held in his gaze was more potent than any smile could have been. It was a connection forged not of warmth, but of a shared understanding of the world's harshness. He gave another one of his curt nods. "The work starts at sunrise," he said, his tone unchanged. "Your room is at the top of the stairs. First door. The pump is out back. We don't waste water." He turned away then, moving toward the fireplace to stir the embers. The silent dismissal clear. The conversation, such as it was over. Delilah stood for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the leather gloves. She reached out and picked one up. The leather was thick and stiff, smelling faintly of the man who had worn it. It felt solid in her hand. It felt real. She looked over at the broad, unmoving back of Boone McAllister, then turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving her suitcase, the symbol of her past, sitting by the door. She had a place to put it now. Sleep was a shallow, restless thing, and Delilah woke before the first hint of dawn. The air in her small room was bitingly cold, and for a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. The unfamiliar shape of the window, the starkness of the unadorned walls, the scent of pine and old dust, it all came back to her in a rush. Red Mesa Ranch. Mr. McAllister. The work starts at sunrise. She rose from the thin mattress, the floorboards icy beneath her bare feet. There was no hesitation. A strange sense of purpose, something she hadn't felt in years, propelled her into motion. She washed her face with the frigid water from the pitcher on her nightstand, the shock of it chasing away the last vestiges of sleep. She dressed quickly in her plainest calico dress, a faded blue garment meant for work, and braided her hair into a tight, practical coil at the nape of her neck. Her first task was water, following Boone McAllister's terse instructions from the night before. She made her way downstairs and out the back door into the pre-dawn gloom. The world was a symphony of grays and deep blues. The air was so crisp it felt sharp in her lungs. The water pump stood like a lone sentinel in the middle of the yard, a tall, iron arm reaching for the pale sky. Delilah gripped the handle. It was heavier than she'd expected, and achingly cold. She had to put her whole body into the motion, her sore muscles protesting with every heave. Up and down. The pump groaned in the stillness, a rusty, complaining sound. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came a gurgle from deep within the earth, and finally, a gush of clear, frigid water splashed into the bucket she'd placed beneath the spout. She worked until she had filled 2 large buckets, her breath coming in white plumes. As she carried them back to the house, the weight straining her arms and shoulders, the eastern sky was beginning to bleed with the first pale streaks of pink and gold. Sunrise was coming. The work had begun. She stepped into the kitchen and paused on the threshold. This was to be her domain. In the growing light, she could see it clearly for the first time. It was a large, square room, the undisputed heart of the house, yet it felt as if its heart had stopped beating long ago. A massive cast-iron stove, big enough to cook for 20 men, stood cold and silent against one wall. A long, scarred wooden table, sturdy enough for butchering, occupied the center of the room. Open shelves lined another wall, holding a sparse collection of tin plates, thick ceramic mugs, and dusty, unlabeled jars. The room was not dirty, not in the way a bachelor's neglected cabin would be. There was no rotting food or clutter, but it was profoundly neglected. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the stale, lonely smell of disuse. It was a space that had been maintained to a minimal standard of function, but it had not been lived in for a very long time. It felt like a room holding its breath, waiting. Delilah set the water buckets down and began her exploration. She ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of the work table, imagining the loaves of bread that must have been kneaded upon it. She opened the door of the stove's firebox and found it swept clean of ash. She lifted a heavy cast-iron skillet from a hook. It was well seasoned, its surface smooth and black, a tool that had seen years of faithful service. As she moved through the room, she began to find them the faint, lingering traces of the woman who had presided over this kitchen before her. Boone McAllister's mother. There was a set of earthenware crocks on a high shelf. When Delilah wiped the dust from one, she found a delicate, hand-painted bluebird on its side, a small touch of artistry in a world of harsh practicality. She discovered a wooden rolling pin, worn smooth with use, with the faint, almost invisible initials E.M. burned into one handle. In a drawer filled with mismatched cutlery, she found a small, silver spoon, its handle tarnished but engraved with a looping, elegant Eleonora. Eleonora McAllister. The name felt soft in a house of such hard edges. Delilah imagined a woman standing where she now stood, her hands dusted with flour, the warmth of the stove on her face. A woman who had brought bluebirds and engraved silver to this rugged, unforgiving land. The work of reclaiming the kitchen was slow and methodical. Delilah began with the stove, the cold heart of the room. She hauled in kindling and logs from a woodpile outside the back door, her movements economical and sure. She had learned to build a fire from nothing as a girl, and soon, a steady, Hungry roar filled the firebox, chasing the chill from the room. She put a great kettle of water on to boil and began to scrub. She scoured the shelves, wiped down the walls, and washed the single large window until the morning sun streamed in, illuminating the dancing dust motes she had disturbed. With every stroke of her cleaning rag, she felt as if she were performing a rite of respect. She was not erasing the memory of Eleanora McAllister. She was honoring it. She was waking the kitchen from its long slumber. In a small, lidded tin box at the back of a high shelf, tucked behind a row of pickling jars, she found a photograph. It was a formal, sepia-toned portrait. A woman with a stern, unsmiling face stared out at her, her hair pulled back in a severe style that could not entirely contain its thickness. Her dress was dark and high-collared. She was not beautiful in the delicate way Delilah had imagined. Her face was strong, her jaw determined, her eyes clear and direct. There was a resilience in her gaze that felt achingly familiar. Standing beside her, his hand resting stiffly on her shoulder, was a boy of about 12. He was tall for his age, with the same serious mouth and dark, watchful eyes as the man of the house. It was Boone. In the photograph, he looked just as guarded and silent as he did now. The woman, Eleanora, had one hand resting on her son's, a gesture of quiet, undemonstrative possession. Delilah stared at the photograph for a long time. She saw the source of Boone's unyielding nature, and she saw the strength that had been the foundation of this ranch. She imagined the winter the outline had spoken of the brutal, killing cold that had taken this formidable woman. She carefully wiped the dust from the tin box and placed the photograph back inside, returning it to its place on the shelf. She would not ask about her. It was not her story to ask for. Boone did not speak, and she would learn the language of his silence. By the time the sun was fully risen, the kitchen was transformed. It was warm, clean, and filled with the rich, promising smells of brewing coffee and frying bacon. Delilah had found flour, cornmeal, and a slab of salt-cured bacon in the pantry. She worked with a focused intensity, mixing a batch of biscuits, her hands moving with a forgotten muscle memory. She heard his boots on the porch, a heavy, rhythmic tread that did not falter. The back door opened, and Boone McAllister entered the kitchen. He stopped just inside the doorway, and for a moment, he did not move. His gaze swept the room, taking in the gleaming stovetop, the clean window, the neat shelves, the welcoming warmth. His expression did not change. The hard lines of his face remained fixed, but Delilah saw his eyes linger for a fraction of a second on the shelf where the crocks with the bluebirds now sat, clean and bright. He walked to the table and sat down in the same chair he must have occupied 1,000 times before. He placed his hat on the table beside him. He did not say good morning. He did not comment on the state of the kitchen. He simply sat and waited. Delilah's hands trembled slightly as she dished out a plate for him, 3 fried eggs with firm yolks, several rashers of crisp bacon, and 2 golden brown biscuits. She placed the plate in front of him, along with a thick mug of black coffee. She moved back to the stove, turning her back to him, pretending to be busy wiping down a counter. She felt his presence like a physical weight in the room. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scrape of his fork against the plate. She did not watch him eat, but she was aware of every bite. She listened to the rhythmic sounds of his meal, a quiet, steady process that was as functional as everything else about the man. When the sound stopped, she heard his chair scrape back. She turned to see him standing, putting on his hat. His plate was empty, wiped clean with the last of the biscuit. He looked at her for a moment, his gaze as direct and unreadable as it had been the night before. Then he turned and walked out the door, letting it close quietly behind him. He hadn't said a word, not a thank you, not a compliment, not a critique, nothing. For a moment, a wave of disappointment washed over Delilah, but then she looked at the empty plate. In a world of polite lies and meaningless pleasantries, that clean plate was the most honest compliment she had ever received. It was a silent acknowledgement. The work was satisfactory. She had met the standard, and so the ritual was born. Every morning, Delilah rose before dawn to breathe life back into Eleanora McAllister's kitchen. She made the coffee strong and the biscuits light. And every morning, just as the sun cleared the mesas, Boone McAllister would enter, sit at the table in silence, and eat the breakfast she prepared. He always had eggs. She learned to cook them exactly as he seemed to like them, with the whites set but the yolk still soft enough to be broken with a piece of biscuit. They never spoke during these morning meals. Some days, other ranch hands would join him. Gruff, weathered men who would nod at her and murmur their thanks, their presence filling the kitchen with the smell of leather and dust. But Boone remained a silent, imposing figure at the head of his table. He would eat, he would drink his coffee, and he would leave. His silence was a wall, but the kitchen was the small gate through which he passed every single day. And Delilah, standing by the warm stove, understood. She did not ask about the woman in the photograph. He did not speak of the mother who had painted bluebirds on her flower crock. But every morning, when he came into the warm, clean kitchen and ate the food she had made, a silent, unspoken conversation took place. It was a conversation about memory, about continuance, about the quiet, relentless work of survival. And it was enough. The days at Red Mesa had settled into a rhythm, as steady and predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. Delilah found a quiet contentment in the work. It was hard, honest labor that left her muscles aching but her mind blessedly clear. She learned the particular groan of the floorboards that announced Boone's approach in the morning, the specific clang of the dinner bell that brought the ranch hands in from the fields, and the deep, resonant silence of the house after nightfall. The kitchen had become her sanctuary, a warm, fragrant world she had brought back to life. She was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived in the dark. She was the quiet, competent force that kept the heart of the ranch beating. She had even started a small herb garden near the back door, coaxing stubborn sprigs of parsley, thyme, and rosemary from the unforgiving soil. It was a small patch of green, a defiant bit of beauty against the vast backdrop of red earth and blue sky. It was there, on her knees in the warm afternoon sun, tending to her fledgling plants, that the past came back to find her. She didn't see him approach. The first sign was a shadow falling over her, blocking the sun. She looked up, shielding her eyes with a dirt-smudged hand, expecting to see one of the ranch hands with a question about supper. But it was not a face she recognized from the ranch. It was a face she had prayed she would never see again. "Well, I'll be," the man said, a slow, familiar smile spreading across his thin lips. "Delilah Hart, hiding out at the edge of the world. I always did say you had a talent for disappearing." His name was Fletcher Reed. He was handsome in a way that had gone to seed, his features sharp but softened by a life of easy choices and late nights. He wore a dusty town coat that had once been fine and a hat cocked at an angle that was meant to be charming but now just looked weary. The sight of him sent a jolt of pure, cold dread through Delilah's veins, paralyzing her where she knelt. The memories came in a sickening, chaotic rush. Just as the outline had dictated, the frantic pace was upon her. A gaslit parlor in St. Joseph, Fletcher's hand, warm on hers, his voice a low, persuasive murmur. Just a small loan. "Delilah, to tide me over. You know my luck is about to turn." Her position as a governess to a wealthy family, the trust she had carefully built, her foolish, compassionate heart believing his lies, taking the money from the household accounts, leaving a note promising to pay it back. Fletcher, of course, disappeared. The family, discovering the theft, did not care for her explanations. They saw only a dishonest employee, a woman of low character easily swayed by a handsome gambler. The dismissal, the shame, the whispers that followed her everywhere. She's the one, involved with that card sharp, the loss of her reputation, a thing more valuable than any amount of money. "Fletcher," she breathed, her voice a dry whisper. She rose slowly to her feet, instinctively wiping her hands on her apron, a futile attempt to scrub away the sudden filth of his presence. "What are you doing here?" "Business, of course. Always business," he said, his eyes roaming past her, taking in the solid ranch house, the sprawling barns, the vast herds of cattle grazing in the distance. His gaze was avaricious. "And it seems your luck has turned as well. You've landed on your feet, landed quite comfortably, from the looks of it." "This is my place of work," she said, her voice firming with a protective instinct she didn't know she possessed. "You have no business here. You need to leave." He chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Now, is that any way to greet an old friend? An old friend who knows all your secrets?" He took a step closer, and Delilah flinched back. "I heard whispers in Dust Pine. A new woman up at the McAllister place. Quiet, keeps to herself. I had a hunch it might be you. You always did prefer to be a ghost." The quiet rhythm of her life was shattering. The peace she had so carefully constructed was turning to glass dust around her feet. He was a sickness she thought she had purged, returned to infect her new life. "What do you want?" "Fletcher," she asked, her tone flat and cold. "A simple conversation with your employer," he said, his eyes glinting. "A man of his stature, a man like Boone McAllister. He values his good name. He values a quiet, orderly life. I imagine he'd be willing to pay a small price to keep it that way, to avoid any unpleasantness, any talk spreading about the sort of woman he's brought into his home." The threat was clear, and it was vile. He would use her past, the past he had created for her, to extort money from the man who had given her a second chance. The shame was so potent, so suffocating she felt she might faint. "You will do no such thing," she said, her voice trembling with a rage that surprised her. "You will get on your horse and you will ride away from this ranch." "I don't think so," Fletcher said, his smile widening. "I think I'll wait right here for Mr. McAllister, too." He stopped talking. His eyes had shifted to a point just over Delilah's shoulder, and the smug confidence on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of apprehension. Delilah didn't need to turn around. She felt a change in the air, the same way the prairie grass senses a coming storm. The temperature seemed to drop. A large, solid shadow fell beside her own. Boone McAllister had come up from the stables, his stride silent on the soft earth. He stood there, tall and unmoving, his expression as hard and unreadable as a granite cliff. His eyes were not on Delilah. They were fixed on Fletcher Reed, and they held a flat, chilling stillness. He did not ask who the man was. He did not ask what was happening. He simply stood between Fletcher and Delilah, a silent, immovable wall of a man. Fletcher, to his credit, recovered quickly. He straightened his coat and adopted a tone of false bonhomie. "Mr. McAllister. I presume Fletcher Reed. I was just having a chat with your housekeeper here, about old times." Boone did not respond. He didn't even nod. He just watched, his silence more powerful than any threat. "The thing is," Fletcher continued, his voice losing some of its swagger, "Miss Hart and we have a shared history, from her time back in Missouri, a history that some folks might find interesting. I was just explaining to her that for a man like you, discretion is key. I'm a discreet man, Mr. McAllister, and I'm prepared to offer you my continued discretion, for a modest fee, to ensure Miss Hart's past stays in the past, where it belongs." Boone's expression did not flicker. His gaze remained locked on Fletcher, cold and dissecting. He took one slow, deliberate step forward. He was not overtly threatening, but the sheer, condensed power in his stillness was terrifying. The air crackled with it. He was a force of nature, a plain storm gathering its strength. Fletcher took an involuntary step back. His bravado was evaporating under the weight of that silent, unwavering gaze. He was a man used to manipulating people with words, with innuendo and social pressure. He had no defense against this kind of primal, elemental presence. "There's no need for any trouble," Fletcher stammered, raising his hands slightly. Just a simple business proposition. Boone said nothing. He simply held the man's gaze. The silence stretched for an agonizingly long time. Delilah found she couldn't breathe. She could feel the tension radiating from Boone, a controlled, lethal calm. He was protecting her, not by shouting or drawing a weapon, but by standing his ground and making it clear that this was his land, and she was under his protection. Finally, Fletcher broke. He couldn't stand the pressure. He dropped his eyes, licked his dry lips, and took another shuffling step backward. "Fine, be that way," he muttered, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. "But don't say I didn't warn you when the stories start." He turned and walked away with a speed that was just shy of a run. He untied his horse from the fence post, swung himself into the saddle without looking back, and spurred the animal into a gallop, kicking up a cloud of red dust as he fled. Delilah watched him go until he was a small, insignificant speck on the horizon. The ranch was silent again. The only sounds the buzz of a bee in her herb garden and the soft whisper of the wind. But the peace was gone. The rhythm was broken. She finally turned to face Boone. She couldn't meet his eyes. She stared at the worn leather of his boots, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She waited for the questions. She waited for the anger, the accusation, the cold, final words of dismissal. She had brought trouble to his door. She had tainted his quiet, orderly life with a stain of her own past. But he said nothing. He stood there for a long moment, and then she heard his heavy footsteps as he turned and walked back toward the barn, leaving her alone with the ghost he had just banished, and the terrible, suffocating silence that remained. The rest of the day passed in a blur of misery. Delilah went through the motions of her work, her hands scrubbing and chopping and stirring, but her mind was a whirlwind of shame and fear. Every creak of the house made her jump, certain it was Boone coming to tell her to pack her single suitcase. The silence at the dinner table that evening was heavier than ever before. The ranch hands seemed to sense the tension, eating quickly and quietly before retreating to the bunkhouse. Finally, only she and Boone were left in the kitchen. She was washing the last of the pots at the sink, her back to him, when he finally spoke. His voice, when it came, was low and quiet, holding none of the anger she had expected. "Was he one of them?" Delilah froze, her hands submerged in the hot, soapy water. She knew exactly what he meant. She didn't have to turn around. One of what she whispered, though she knew the answer. "Your bad choices," he said. The question was so direct, so devoid of judgment, that it broke through her defenses. There was no point in lying, no point in trying to explain or excuse. The truth was a simple, ugly thing. She closed her eyes, and the image of Fletcher's charming, deceitful smile flashed behind her eyelids. She could only manage a single, wretched nod. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. He was one of them. She waited for the verdict. This was the end of her new life, the end of the quiet peace she had found. She braced herself for the words, "Pack your things." She heard his chair scrape as he stood up. She heard his boots cross the wooden floor. He stopped right behind her. She could feel his presence, the warmth and solidity of him, and she squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow to fall. He was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice coming from just over her shoulder, low and rough but clear as a prairie stream. "We all make them." Delilah's eyes snapped open. She held her breath, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "We all make bad choices," Boone said again, "but I'm choosing to keep you." She turned around slowly, her hands dripping water onto the floorboards. She looked up into his face. His expression was as serious as ever, his eyes as deep and guarded. But there was something new there, something she had only glimpsed once before, that flicker of recognition, of understanding. He wasn't condoning her past. He was acknowledging it, and he was choosing to see the woman who stood before him now, not the girl who had made a mistake in Missouri. He had seen the ugliest part of her history, and he had not sent her away. He had stood between her and her past, a silent guardian. And now, he was offering her not forgiveness, which she didn't feel she deserved, but something far more valuable: acceptance. Tears she hadn't even known were there sprang to her eyes. Blurring his stoic face, she didn't know what to say. The words "thank you" felt impossibly small, utterly inadequate for the magnitude of the gift he had just given her. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say the matter was settled. Then he turned and left the kitchen, leaving her standing in the warm, lamp-lit room. The silence no longer a source of fear, but a space filled with a profound and staggering sense of relief. He had chosen to keep her, and in that choice, Delilah Hart felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she might actually be worth keeping. The first snow came not with a furious blizzard, but as a quiet promise in the dead of night. Delilah woke to a world transformed, hushed and radiant under a thick, white blanket. The sharp, rugged edges of the mesas were softened. The endless expanse of red earth was gone, and the pine trees on the distant ridges stood cloaked in ermine, their dark green branches heavy with clinging snow. The world had been scrubbed clean, its flaws and scars buried under a layer of pristine white. Winter, when it arrived in earnest, was a formidable force. It was a season of isolation, a time when the ranch drew into itself like a great beast hibernating against the cold. The 5-mile road to Dust Pine became a treacherous, often impassable track. The wind howled down from the high plains, a mournful, ceaseless cry that rattled the window panes and searched for any crack in the solid timber walls of the house. For weeks on end, the world was nothing but the cluster of ranch buildings, the steam-breathing cattle huddled together for warmth, and the vast, unending canvas of the snow. But within the walls of the ranch house, a different kind of transformation was taking place. The cold and the isolation did not breed resentment. They forged a quiet, resilient community. And Delilah, who had arrived as a stranger, a ghost with a past, slowly and surely became its heart. Her days were still governed by the rhythm of hard work, but the nature of that work changed with the season. The mornings were a battle against the cold, her first task always to stoke the embers in the great kitchen stove, coaxing it into a roaring furnace that pushed back the chill. The scent of her strong coffee and frying bacon became the true signal of mourning for the entire ranch. The kitchen, once a silent, neglected space, was now the undeniable center of their world, a haven of warmth and light against the bleakness outside. As the weeks wore on, her duties expanded beyond the kitchen. The ranch hands, rough, solitary men who had initially regarded her with cautious distance, began to treat her with a gruff, familial affection. A young, freckle-faced cowboy named Jedediah tore his favorite wool shirt on a snag of barbed wire and brought it to her with a sheepish, apologetic look. Delilah took it without a word and mended it that evening by the firelight, her needle flashing in and out, the small, neat stitches a testament to her care. Soon, a small pile of worn-out socks, torn gloves, and split seams began to appear on a corner of the kitchen table, and she would mend them all, her quiet industry a part of the evening ritual. She discovered a surprisingly gentle side to these hard men, an older hand, a man they called Silas, whose face was a leathery map of his long life, would sometimes bring her a perfectly formed pine cone or a uniquely shaped stone he'd found while checking the fence lines. Jedediah, clumsy in his attempts at conversation, would tell her long, rambling stories about his family's farm back in Ohio, his words painting a picture of a life so different from this one. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Jedediah, trying to lighten the mood, told a particularly terrible joke about a horse walking into a saloon. The punchline was so nonsensical that, after a moment of confused silence, Delilah let out a laugh. It wasn't a small, polite chuckle, but a genuine, clear, and musical laugh that filled the room. The men all stopped what they were doing and stared at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and delight. She flushed, suddenly self-conscious, but Jedediah beamed with pride. From his corner near the fire, where he was oiling a piece of tack, Boone McAllister looked up. He didn't smile, but his intense gaze rested on her for a long moment, and the look in his eyes was no longer just one of recognition, but of something softer, something that looked almost like warmth. Boone himself was changing, though his transformation was as slow and subtle as the melting of a glacier. He remained a man of few words, his presence as silent and imposing as ever. But Delilah began to notice small things, quiet acts of consideration that spoke louder than any words could. One morning, while trying to break the thick sheet of ice that had formed overnight in the chicken's water trough, she swung the axe with more force than skill. The clumsy blow missed the ice and landed squarely on the wooden side of the trough, splitting the thick plank with a sickening crack. Water began to gush out onto the frozen ground, mortified at her mistake, at the waste and the damage. She spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet shame, expecting a cold reprimand that never came. The next morning, when she went out at dawn, she found the trough was repaired. A new, perfectly fitted piece of timber had been skillfully set into place, the seams sealed tight against any leaks. There was no sign of the work, no stray wood shavings, no tools left behind. It was as if it had fixed itself. But she knew it had been Boone, working in the freezing dark after she had gone to bed, silently mending what she had broken. Her work gloves, the ones he had given her on her first night, had become stiff and worn. The leather was cracked from the constant cycle of being wet and then dry, and the seams on two of the fingers had split open, exposing her skin to the biting cold. She had tried to mend them, but the leather was too thick for her needle. She simply endured, her hands often raw and chapped by the end of the day. Then, one morning, she came down to the kitchen to find a new pair of gloves resting on the table, right next to the spot where she always set her morning coffee. They were made of soft, supple deerskin, lined with wool, and stitched with a craftsman's precision. She picked them up, the leather warm and smooth against her skin. She looked out the window and saw Boone crossing the yard toward the barn, his broad back to her. He had seen her need, and he had met it, silently and without any expectation of thanks. The winter wore on, a long, quiet season of shared meals, mended clothes, and unspoken gestures. Delilah felt the tight, fearful knot in her heart, a knot she had carried for years, slowly begin to loosen. She was not just a housekeeper. She was a part of this place. She was respected, she was needed, and she was, in her own quiet way, cared for. The news of the dance came with the first thaw. Silas had made the treacherous journey into Dust Pine for supplies and returned with mail, news, and a notice from the town's small church. They were holding a social and a dance to celebrate the end of the harsh winter, a chance for the scattered and isolated homesteaders and ranchers to come together. There was a buzz of excitement in the bunkhouse as the younger hands talked of cleaning their best boots and airing out their town shirts. Delilah paid it little mind. Dances and socials were for other people, for girls with untarnished reputations and easy smiles. They were part of a life she had left behind in Missouri. She was content with her place here, with the quiet rhythm of the ranch. That evening, after the kitchen was clean and the house had settled into its nightly quiet, she retired to her room. She was sitting in the small rocking chair by the window, mending a tear in her own apron by the light of a single candle, when she heard a hesitant knock on her door. She frowned. None of the hands would ever presume to knock on her door. It could only be one person. "Come in," she called out, her heart giving a strange, unexpected flutter. The door opened, and Boone McAllister stood on the threshold. He didn't step into the room but lingered in the doorway, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over in a gesture of uncharacteristic nervousness. He was not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on a point on the floor just to her left. "Miss Hart," he began, his voice low and a little rough. "Mr. McAllister," she replied, setting her sewing aside. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong." He cleared his throat. The silence stretched for a moment. Silas mentioned the church social in town tomorrow evening." "Yes, I heard," she said, wondering where this was going. He finally chanced a quick, fleeting glance at her before his eyes darted away again. "I was wondering if you were free tomorrow evening." Delilah stared at him. The question hung in the air between them. So unexpected, so completely out of character for this silent, solitary man, that she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. He was asking her to the dance. Boone McAllister, who barely spoke 2 words to her in a week, was asking her to a social gathering. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself so rigidly, as if expecting a refusal. She saw the vulnerability in his averted gaze, and a wave of tenderness, warm and overwhelming, washed through her. All those months of silent observation, of shared space and unspoken understanding, had led to this moment, to this awkward, halting question. Her past, the ghost of Fletcher Reed and the shame of Missouri, whispered in her ear. A woman like her, at a church social with the most respected rancher in the county. It would cause talk. It would cause stares. It was a risk. For both of them. It was, by any sensible measure, a bad choice. And a slow smile spread across Delilah's face. It was a real smile, confident and warm, and touched with a hint of playful mischief. "Another bad choice, Mr. McAllister?" she asked softly. The words were a quiet intimacy, a reference to the secret they shared, to the night he had accepted her past and chosen to keep her. It was a gentle tease, a way of telling him that she understood the risk, and that she was not afraid. He looked up, and his eyes finally met hers. He seemed startled by her response, by the smile in her voice. He saw no fear in her, no hesitation, only a quiet, shining acceptance. And then, for the first time since she had arrived at Red Mesa, Boone McAllister smiled. It was not a large smile. It started slowly, a hesitant lifting at the corners of his mouth, but it was genuine, and it transformed his entire face. The hard lines around his eyes softened. The stern set of his jaw relaxed, and for a brief, breathtaking moment, the deep, guarded sadness in his eyes was replaced by a light she had never seen before. It was a smile that reached all the way to his soul. "Maybe," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but I'm willing to make it." The day of the church social dawned clear and cold. A brilliant, unforgiving sun shone down on the snow-covered landscape, making the world glitter as if it were coated in diamond dust. For Delilah, the day was a strange mixture of quiet dread and a fluttering, unfamiliar excitement. Her decision to accept Boone's invitation, made in a moment of shared, smiling courage, now had to be faced in the stark light of day. She spent the morning on her usual chores, but her hands felt clumsy and her mind was elsewhere. She found herself staring out the kitchen window at the vast, white world, her thoughts consumed by the evening to come. She had nothing to wear. Her 2 practical calico work dresses were clean and mended, but they were symbols of her station, not garments for a social gathering. The gray traveling dress she had arrived in was drab and held memories she would rather forget. To attend a dance was one thing. To do so in a way that screamed of her lowly position was another. It would only give the whispering gossips of Dust Pine more ammunition. After the midday meal was served and cleaned away, she went to her room. In the bottom of her old suitcase, wrapped in a piece of clean linen, was a length of fabric she had purchased on a rare trip to town with Silas weeks ago. It had been an indulgence, bought with the first money she had truly been able to call her own. It was a deep, midnight blue wool, the color of the sky just after the last trace of sunset has vanished. It was not fancy, but the color was rich and the fabric was sturdy and warm. She had bought it with no specific purpose in mind, only a vague, hopeful notion of making a new dress for herself someday. Today was someday. With a pair of sewing shears and a determination born of necessity, she set to work. She had no pattern, only her own measurements and a clear memory of a dress she had once admired in a shop window in St. Joseph. The silence of the afternoon was broken only by the snip of her shears and the rhythmic pull of thread through fabric. Her stitches were small and even, a skill learned over years of mending and making do. As she worked, she poured all of her hopes for the evening into the garment. She stitched in her desire to not embarrass Boone, her prayer for a moment of simple, uncomplicated joy, and her quiet, fierce resolve to hold her head high no matter how many people stared. The dress was simple. It had a modest, high neckline, long, fitted sleeves, and a skirt that was full enough for dancing but not frivolous. It had no lace, no ribbons, no adornment of any kind. Its only beauty was in its stark simplicity and the way it was made to fit her body perfectly. It was a dress that was honest, just like the work she did. It was, she thought as she held it up in the fading afternoon light, the most real dress she had ever owned. As dusk settled over the ranch, she washed herself with the icy water from her pitcher, the cold a bracing shock that steadied her nerves. She dressed with trembling hands, the soft wool of the new dress a comfort against her skin. It fit as if it were a part of her. When she looked at her reflection in the small, wavy mirror above her washstand, she did not see a disgraced governess or a lonely housekeeper. She saw a woman who was nervous, yes, but who also stood straight and tall, her eyes clear in her past. For once, feeling a little further away, she heard the sound of the wagon pulling up to the front of the house and took one last, deep breath. Boone was waiting for her on the porch. He had changed out of his work clothes into a clean, dark coat, a crisp white shirt, and trousers that had been carefully brushed. He looked impossibly tall and solid under the porch light. He was holding a heavy, folded wool blanket. When she stepped out of the door, he turned, and for a moment, he just looked at her. He took in the simple, perfect dress, the way the dark blue fabric made her skin seem luminous, and the quiet courage in her eyes. His own gaze, usually so guarded, held a look of profound, undisguised appreciation. He did not say, "You look beautiful." He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it for him. The 5-mile journey to town was made in a comfortable silence. The night was breathtakingly clear. The snow-covered plains bathed in the ethereal silver light of a full moon. Boone expertly guided the horses. The only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels on the packed snow and the jingle of the harness. He carefully tucked the heavy wool blanket around her lap, his large, rough fingers brushing against her for a fraction of a second, sending a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the wool. The silence between them was no longer tense or awkward. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding that felt more intimate than any conversation. The church in Dust Pine was ablaze with light, its windows glowing like beacons in the cold, dark night. The sound of a lively fiddle tune spilled out into the street, a joyful, energetic sound that promised warmth and company. The yard was filled with wagons and horses, a testament to how starved the scattered community was for a reason to gather. When Boone helped her down from the wagon, his hand firm on her elbow, Delilah's heart began to pound against her ribs. This was it. She could feel the eyes on them even before they reached the door. She took a deep breath and looped her arm through his, her small hand resting in the crook of his powerful arm. Together, they walked up the steps and into the light. The moment they stepped through the door, a hush fell over the crowded room. The fiddler's bow seemed to falter for a beat. Every head turned in their direction. It was as if the entire town had collectively held its breath. They saw Boone McAllister, the quiet, solitary rancher who kept to himself, a man as rugged and unapproachable as the mesas that bore his family's name, and on his arm was a woman no one recognized. A woman with a calm, serious face and eyes that held a story they couldn't read, wearing a simple blue dress that somehow outshone all the frills and finery in the room. Then the whispers began. They rippled through the crowd like a breeze through dry grass. "Who is that? It's his housekeeper, the one who arrived last fall. Where did he find her? I heard she came from back east." The stares were intense, a mixture of raw curiosity, speculation, and, from some of the town's unmarried women, undisguised resentment. Delilah felt a familiar, cold dread begin to creep up her spine. This was what she had feared, to be an object of gossip, a puzzle to be picked apart and judged. She felt her posture stiffen, her fragile confidence beginning to crumble. Her hand, resting on Boone's arm, tightened into a fist, her knuckles pressing against the coarse wool of his coat. "I'm used to being looked at," she murmured, her voice so low it was almost lost in the rising hum of conversation. It was a statement of weary resignation, an admission of a life spent under the weight of others' judgment. Boone looked down at her. His face was calm, unaffected by the stares. He covered her trembling hand with his own large, warm one, a simple, grounding gesture of reassurance. "They're looking," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for her, "because you're hard to forget." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just offering comfort. He was offering a new perspective. He took the very thing that had been the source of her shame, her visibility, her past, the fact that she was memorable for all the wrong reasons, and recast it as a source of strength. He was not ashamed to be seen with her. He was proud. In that moment, the whispers of the crowd faded to an insignificant buzz. The only thing that mattered was the steady pressure of his hand on hers and the truth she saw in his eyes. The fiddler, recovering himself, struck up the first notes of a waltz. The music was sweet and lilting, a hopeful, gentle melody. Boone looked at her, and in his eyes was a silent question. Delilah gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He led her to the center of the cleared floor. The other couples seemed to melt away, giving them a wide berth, their curiosity still palpable. For a terrifying second, Delilah's mind went blank. She had not danced in years. She was sure she would be clumsy, that she would stumble and shame them both. Then Boone placed one hand firmly on the small of her back and took her other hand in his. His grip was sure and steady. He was not a man of frivolous graces, but he was a man of quiet, physical confidence. He did not wait for her to find her footing. He simply began to move, his steps measured and certain, guiding her into the rhythm of the music. Her first few steps were stiff and hesitant. She was afraid to put her trust in him, afraid to let go, but his lead was undeniable. A firm, gentle pressure that anticipated her every move and corrected her every falter before it could happen. He was not forcing her. He was supporting her, creating a space where she could not fail. And so, she let go. She stopped thinking about the steps, stopped thinking about the eyes that were watching them, and simply allowed herself to be led. She put her faith in the steady strength of the man who held her, a man who had already proven he would not let her fall. He knew how to lead, and she was finally learning how to trust. Their movements became fluid. A silent conversation set to music. They were no longer a man and a woman surrounded by a crowd, but two solitary figures moving as one in a world of their own making. She looked up at his face. In the warm lantern light, the hard lines of it seemed to soften. His gaze was focused entirely on her, his usual guard down, his eyes holding an expression of such profound, quiet intensity that it made her breath catch in her throat. He saw her, not her past, not her position, but the woman she was in that moment, turning in his arms. In that single, weighted glance, 1,000 unspoken things were communicated. She saw in his eyes a deep, lonely place that had finally found a companion. He saw in hers a gentle strength that had finally found a safe harbor. They danced, and the room, the whispers, and the world outside of his arms simply ceased to exist. When the music finally faded and came to a stop, they stood for a moment in the center of the floor, his hand still on her back, hers still in his, the echo of the melody hanging in the air between them. The silence was broken by the sound of scattered, then enthusiastic applause. The town had watched, and they had seen. The whispers had died, replaced by a grudging, then genuine, respect. They did not speak. There was nothing that needed to be said. He led her from the dance floor, and the journey home was made in the same deep, comfortable silence as the journey there. But something had fundamentally changed. The space between them was now filled not with uncertainty, but with the warm, glowing memory of a shared dance, a silent promise whispered in the heart of a cold, western night. The weeks that followed the church dance were a time of quiet, unprecedented peace. The harsh winter finally broke, its icy grip yielding to the persistent warmth of the spring sun. The snow melted away, revealing a landscape reborn. The rich red earth dotted with the tender green of new grass. The creek, which had been frozen solid, now ran full and fast, its cheerful gurgle a constant, life-affirming sound. A fragile hope had taken root in Delilah's heart, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it might actually grow. The silent understanding between her and Boone had deepened. Words remained a scarce currency between them, but they were no longer necessary. They spoke in shared glances over the supper table, in the comfortable silence of the evenings spent in the main room, and in the small, unspoken acts of service that defined their days. He had, in his own quiet way, claimed her, and she, in hers, had accepted. The whispers in dust pine had faded, replaced by nods of respect. She was no longer just the housekeeper. She was Boone McAllister's woman, and the title, unofficial as it was, felt like a shield. It was on a moonless, star-strewn night in late spring that the shield was shattered, and their peaceful world was consumed by fire. Delilah was asleep, dreaming of a field of wildflowers. When the smell first pricked at her senses, it was a sharp, acrid scent that didn't belong in her dream. She stirred, her nose twitching, and the smell grew stronger, pulling her from the depths of sleep. It was the smell of burning pine, wood smoke, but it was too close, too thick. Then she heard it, a sound that cut through the deep silence of the night and chilled her to the bone. It was the high, terrified screaming of a horse. She was out of bed in an instant, her heart slamming against her ribs. She ran to her small window and looked out. The sight that met her eyes was a vision from hell. The horse barn, the largest and proudest structure on the ranch, was engulfed in a furious, roaring torrent of orange and red flames. The fire was eating through the dry timber with an insatiable hunger, sending a geyser of sparks and thick black smoke into the night sky. The terrible, panicked shrieks of the trapped horses rose above the roar of the blaze. Fear, cold and absolute, seized her for a moment, but it was immediately consumed by a surge of adrenaline. There was no time for fear. She pulled on her boots over her bare feet, not bothering with a dress, her thin cotton nightgown her only covering. She threw open her door and ran down the hall, pounding on Boone's door with both fists. "Mr. McAllister Boone." "Fire!" she screamed, her voice raw. "The barn is on fire!" She didn't wait for an answer. She flew down the stairs and out the back door, shouting at the top of her lungs. "Fire, everybody! Wake up, fire in the barn!" The bunkhouse door burst open, and the hands, Jedediah and Silas among them, spilled out, their faces pale and shocked in the demonic, flickering light. Boone was right behind her, pulling on his trousers as he ran, his face a grim, stone-like mask of disbelief and fury. The scene in the yard was one of pure, terrifying chaos. The heat from the burning barn was so intense it was painful on the skin even from 100 feet away. The roar was deafening, a monstrous, living sound. The horses, mad with terror, were kicking at their stalls, their frantic, desperate movements visible as dark silhouettes against the wall of flame. "The horses," Boone bellowed, his voice cutting through the din. "Get the doors open. Form a bucket line from the creek, Jed. Silas, with me." He ran toward the great barn doors, heedless of the sparks and falling embers that rained down around him. Delilah, her mind racing, grabbed 2 empty buckets from beside the water pump and ran toward the creek, her bare feet stumbling over the rough ground. The other hands were already there. A frantic, disorganized line of men plunged into a nightmare. She filled her buckets, the icy water splashing over her nightgown, and ran back, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. She passed her buckets to the end of the line and turned to run back for more, her movements becoming a desperate, mechanical rhythm. Fill, run, pass, return. The heat was scorching, the smoke a thick, choking blanket that made her eyes stream and her throat raw. Through the haze, she could see Boone and the others fighting to get the main doors open, the heavy bolts hot to the touch. With a great, collective heave, they finally wrenched them open, and a wave of superheated air and thick smoke billowed out. It was in that moment, as she turned back toward the creek, that she saw him, at the far edge of the firelight, near the dark line of the cottonwood trees. A figure was standing, watching the destruction. He was a silhouette at first, but as he turned to slip away into the shadows, the firelight caught his face for a split second. Fletcher Reed. His face was a mask of smug, malevolent satisfaction, mingled with the cowardly urgency of a man making his escape. Their eyes met across the chaotic yard. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a cold, triumphant cruelty. He knew she saw him. He wanted her to see him. This was his revenge, his answer to the humiliation he had suffered at Boone's silent hand. This destruction, this terror, was his message. It was her fault. A wave of nausea and a guilt so profound it almost brought her to her knees washed over Delilah. Fletcher was the spark, but she was the tinder. Her past had brought this fiery hell down upon them, upon the one place she had found safety, upon the one man who had shown her grace. She had no time to process it. A great shout went up from the men. They had managed to drive out most of the horses, the animals bolting into the night, their coats singed, their eyes wild with terror. But a section of the hayloft, fully engulfed in flames, was beginning to groan and sag, threatening to bring down the whole roof. "That's the last of them," Silas yelled, his face black with soot. "She's gonna go." But Boone, his eyes scanning the smoke-filled interior, saw 2 more horses, a mare and her young foal, trapped in a corner stall, too paralyzed with fear to move. The main support beam above them was glowing cherry red, threatening to give way at any second. "Boone, no!" Silas screamed as Boone grabbed a wet horse blanket and threw it over his head. "It's not worth it." Boone didn't hesitate. He charged back into the burning inferno without a backward glance. Delilah watched, her heart stopping in her chest, as his broad-shouldered form disappeared into the swirling smoke and flame. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The crowd of helpers, which had now swelled with neighbors arriving from nearby homesteads, watched in horrified silence. They heard Boone's powerful voice shouting at the horses, the sound muffled by the roar of the fire. Then, miraculously, the mare and foal burst from the doorway, galloping to safety. A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. But before Boone could follow, the glowing support beam finally gave way. With a terrible, splintering crash, a section of the burning roof collapsed right where he had been standing. Delilah screamed his name, a raw, ragged sound of pure anguish. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. Then, Jedediah and Silas, their faces masks of grim determination, charged into the doorway. A moment later, they emerged, dragging Boone's limp form between them. They pulled him clear just as another section of the roof fell in, sending a fountain of sparks and flames high into the sky. They laid him on the ground, away from the heat. His shirt was smoldering, and a long, wicked burn ran the length of his left arm. A deep gash on his forehead was bleeding freely, but he was conscious, groaning and trying to sit up. Delilah rushed to his side, tearing a strip from the hem of her nightgown to press against the wound on his head. The barn was a total loss, a roaring funeral pyre that would burn itself out by morning. The fight was over. The neighbors and the hands stood in small, stunned groups, their faces grim, watching the destruction. The whispers started, quiet at first, then more insistent. How could this happen? Lightning, maybe no storm tonight. An overturned lantern, all the hands were in the bunkhouse. Delilah, kneeling beside Boone, heard it all. She saw the suspicious glances being cast, the seeds of doubt being sown. Her silence, her secret, had become a poison. Fletcher was gone, but his venom was still at work, threatening to turn this community against the man who had just risked his life for it. She looked at Boone's pain-etched face, at the soot-streaked faces of the men who worked for him, at the frightened neighbors who had come to help. The shame she had carried for so long was a heavy cloak. But the truth, she realized, was a weapon, and she had to use it. She stood up, leaving Boone in the care of Silas. She walked to the center of the yard, into the open space between the onlookers and the burning barn, and turned to face them. Her thin nightgown was torn and soaked. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. Her hair had come undone and hung wildly around her shoulders. She was a vision of chaos, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, ringing with a strength no one there had ever heard from her before. "It wasn't a lantern," she said, her voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "And it wasn't bad luck." Every eye turned to her. The yard fell silent. "There was a man," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the shocked faces. "His name is Fletcher Reed. He came here from my past, from a life I ran from in Missouri. He tried to extort money from Mr. McAllister, to use my mistakes to threaten him. Mr. McAllister sent him away. Tonight, he came back and he did this." She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing herself to meet their stares, to absorb their judgment. "This fire, this is my fault. It is a debt from a bad choice I made a long time ago." A murmur went through the crowd. This was not what they had expected. "Back then," Delilah's voice cracked with emotion, but she did not stop. "When my life fell apart, there was no one stood up for me, no one protected me, no one saved me." She turned and pointed a trembling finger toward where Boone was now sitting up, leaning against Jedediah, his face pale, but his eyes fixed on her with a look of fierce, staggering pride. "But he did," she said, her voice rising with a power she didn't know she possessed. "When that man came here threatening me, Boone McAllister stood between us. He didn't ask questions. He didn't judge. He protected me. And tonight, when those horses were trapped, he didn't hesitate. He ran into that fire to save them. He saved them for this ranch, for his men, for all of us." She was no longer hiding. She stood before them, her past laid bare, her shame offered up as a sacrifice. She had taken the blame, but she had also given them the truth of her own failing, and the greater truth of Boone's undeniable, selfless courage. She finished, her chest heaving, expecting condemnation, expecting to be cast out. The silence that followed was profound. Then, from the back of the crowd, a single rancher, a man she barely knew, began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate sound. He was joined by another, then another. The women, who had once whispered about her, now looked at her with a newfound respect. The applause grew, spreading through the entire crowd, a wave of sound that was not for the drama or the confession, but for something much rarer. It was applause for the raw, unvarnished, and courageous truth. The applause died away, its echoes swallowed by the vast, dark prairie and the hungry crackle of the dying fire. The moment of public triumph faded, leaving behind the grim, painful reality of the night. The neighbors, their duty done, began to depart, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and a newfound respect. The hands, led by a soot-blackened Silas, worked to herd the scattered, terrified horses into a makeshift corral. All that remained in the center of the chaotic yard was the small, focused world around Boone. He was hurt, more badly than he let on. He tried to stand, a stubborn pride warring with the searing pain in his shoulder and the dizzying throb in his head. But a wave of nausea sent him stumbling back into Jedediah's arms. "That's enough of that, boss," Silas said, his voice firm but gentle as he knelt beside him. "You're no good to anyone trying to be a hero twice in one night." Between them, Silas and Jedediah half-carried, half-dragged Boone back to the main house. Delilah followed close behind, her mind a maelstrom of guilt, fear, and a fierce, protective instinct that burned brighter than the embers of the ruined barn. They took him not to his own austere bedroom, but to the larger guest room on the ground floor, the one that had belonged to his parents, its sturdy bed more accessible than the one upstairs. They laid him down gently on the quilt, and Delilah saw, in the full lamplight, the true extent of his injuries. The gash on his forehead was deep, and though the bleeding had slowed, it looked angry and raw. But it was the burn that made her draw a sharp, horrified breath. His left shirt sleeve was mostly burned away, revealing a long, vicious wound that stretched from his shoulder down his upper arm. The skin was red and blistered, a testament to the fire's searing kiss. For the next few days, that room became Delilah's entire world. The ranch and its concerns faded into the background, managed by the capable hands of Silas. Her life narrowed to the four walls of the sick room, to the rise and fall of Boone's chest, and to the quiet, relentless battle against his pain. She became a creature of quiet, tireless motion. She washed the soot and grime from his skin with a gentle hand. The town doctor from Dust Pine made the long ride out, cleaned and stitched the cut on his head, and applied a foul-smelling salve to the burn. Leaving it tightly bandaged, he left instructions, a bottle of laudanum for the pain, and a doubtful look that said the real work of healing was up to the man's own constitution and the care of his nurse. Delilah took on that duty with a devotion that was akin to prayer. She was repaying a debt, not just for the fire, but for the safety and acceptance he had given her. Every act of care was a silent apology, every spoonful of broth a whispered thank you. She learned the landscape of his fevered sleep, the way he would mutter and turn, his hands clenching as if fighting an unseen enemy. She was always there to place a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, her touch gentle, her presence a constant, calming anchor in his sea of pain. Boone was not a good patient. The man who was master of 1,000 acres was now a prisoner in a single bed, and the confinement grated on his soul. In his waking moments, he was restless and irritable, his frustration with his own weakness a palpable force in the room. He hated being dependent, hated being waited on. He would try to sit up, his jaw tight with effort, only to fall back against the pillows, a low groan of pain and fury escaping his lips. "Just lie still," Delilah would murmur, her voice soft but firm, as she adjusted his pillows. "You need to rest. Let your body heal." He would turn his head away from her, his pride wounded, and stare at the wall, his silence a heavy, frustrated thing, but he would obey. He had no choice, and in this forced stillness, he began to watch her. His eyes followed her as she moved about the room. He watched her measure out his medicine with a steady hand. He watched the careful way she changed his bandages, her touch so light and focused it was almost impersonal, yet so full of a deep, underlying tenderness that it made his throat tighten. He watched her in the early mornings, when she thought he was asleep, as she sat in the chair by his bed, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped with an exhaustion she never admitted to. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the worry etched into the lines of her face, and he understood, with a clarity that pierced through his pain, that her devotion was not just a duty, it was something more. The days bled into one another, marked only by the changing light outside the window. Delilah kept a pot of thin, nourishing broth simmering constantly on the kitchen stove, and she would bring him a bowl every few hours. At first, he would refuse it, his pride rebelling, but she would simply wait, her expression patient and unyielding, until his own weakness and hunger forced him to relent. She would sit on the edge of the bed and hold the spoon to his lips, her movements calm and sure, ignoring the faint flush of embarrassment on his unshaven cheeks. This forced intimacy was a crucible, burning away the last of their defenses. He, who had never let anyone see his weakness, was now utterly vulnerable before her. She, who had always hidden her heart for fear of being hurt, was now laying it bare in every gentle touch, every watchful glance. They rarely spoke, but the silence in the sick room was more profound and communicative than any conversation they had ever had. It was a silence of shared pain, of quiet gratitude, of a deep and abiding connection being forged in the heart of their shared disaster. One night, a week after the fire, the fever finally broke. Delilah had been dozing fitfully in the chair, her head resting on her arms on the edge of his bed. She woke with a start to a strange sound, the quiet ticking of the mantel clock in the main room. The silence in the sick room was different. Boone's breathing, which had been harsh and shallow, was now deep and even. She reached out and touched his forehead. It was cool and damp. His eyes were open, and he was looking at her, in the dim light of the single oil lamp. His gaze was clear and lucid for the first time in days. "Delilah," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You're awake," she breathed, a wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. "The fever's gone." "How long?" he asked. "A week," she replied softly. "You've been sleeping mostly." He was silent for a long time, his eyes searching her face, taking in her exhaustion as if seeing it for the first time. The silence stretched, comfortable and deep. The house was still. The hands asleep in the bunkhouse. It felt as if they were the only two people awake in the entire world. He shifted slightly, a wince of pain crossing his features as he moved his bandaged shoulder. She instinctively reached out to steady him, her hand resting on his good arm. "If you could choose again," he said, his voice low and raspy, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were looking directly into her soul. "Knowing what would happen, knowing that man would follow you, would you have come here?" The question stole the air from her lungs. It was not an accusation. It was something far more raw, more vulnerable. He was asking if she regretted him. He was asking if the brief peace she had found at Red Mesa was worth the fiery price they had all paid. He was asking her to weigh his worth against the destruction her past had wrought. She looked at him, at his tired, pale face, at the bandages that were a stark white against his skin in the lamplight. She thought of her life before this place, a life of running, of hiding, of being looked at with suspicion and disdain. She thought of the quiet contentment she had found in his silent company, the startling joy of his first smile, the solid, grounding feel of his hand in hers on the dance floor. And she thought of the fire, the terror, and the ruin. Her lower lip began to tremble. She could not lie to him. The world was a practical, unforgiving place. By any sensible measure, her arrival had been a catastrophe for him. The cost had been immense. "I told you before," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm good at making bad choices." It was the only answer she could give. It was an admission of her own brokenness, a confession that her path seemed to be paved with disaster. It was her way of saying, yes, by all accounts, choosing you was just another in a long line of mistakes. A strange sound escaped him. It was a low, weak chuckle, a sound of pained amusement that held no mockery, only a kind of weary, heartbroken wonder. The faint smile touched his lips, but it was his eyes that held her, filled with an emotion she had never seen there before, a raw and desperate tenderness. "Then make me one of them," he whispered. The words, so soft and yet so powerful, struck her heart with the force of a physical blow. He had heard her confession of being a poor choice, and his response was not to agree. Not to comfort her, but to ask, to plead, to be that choice. If I am a mistake, then make me. If I am a disaster, then choose me. Let me be the best bad choice you've ever made. A sound bubbled up in her throat, a strangled, hysterical noise that was half a laugh and half a sob. She covered her mouth with a trembling hand, trying to hold it in, trying to keep from breaking down completely. Tears she had held back for a week, for a lifetime, finally spilled over, running hot down her cheeks. She was laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the beautiful, perfect, heartbreaking absurdity of it all. He was not offering her a safe harbor from the storms of her life. He was offering to be the storm she ran to, not from. He was not asking her to be perfect. He was asking her to be his. She didn't have to answer. In the dim, quiet sick room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the uncertainty of the future, her tearful, broken laugh was the only answer he would ever need. The weeks after the fire were a blur of construction and quiet convalescence. Boone, stubborn as the winter-hardened earth, was out of bed long before the doctor would have approved, his arm in a sling, his face pale but his will unbending. He directed the rebuilding of the barn with a quiet, fierce intensity, his presence a constant, motivating force for his men and the neighbors who came to help. The air at Red Mesa was thick with the clean, sharp scent of freshly sawn pine and the sounds of hammers and saws, a symphony of renewal that slowly began to erase the memory of the flames. Delilah's confession, which had hung in the firelit air like a final, desperate prayer, had not, as she might have hoped, ended the talk. It had simply given it a new, more fevered direction. When she next traveled to Dust Pine with Silas for supplies, she felt the change immediately. The stares were no longer just curious. They were bold, dissecting. The whispers were not speculative. They were confident, ugly assertions. She walked into the general store, her shopping list clutched in her hand, and the low hum of conversation among the three women gathered by the fabric bolts ceased abruptly. They turned to look at her, their eyes cold and flat with judgment. Delilah felt a familiar, hot flush creep up her neck, but she lifted her chin and met their gazes before turning to the store owner. Mr. Henderson. A 20-pound sack of flour, please, Mr. Henderson, and 5 pounds of coffee. As he heaved the heavy sack onto the counter, one of the women, a Mrs. Gable, whose face was perpetually pinched in a state of disapproval, spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the silent store. It's a wonder he has any stock left to sell, with all the charity he's sending out to Red Mesa. It's not charity, Martha, Mr. Henderson said gruffly, not looking at her. Boone McAllister's credit is good. His credit may be Mrs. Gable sniffed, her eyes still fixed on Delilah. But one has to wonder about his judgment. Taking in strays? The whole town knows she brought that fire down on him. A woman with a past like that. Who knows what other troubles she'll bring? The words were meant to cut, and they did. Delilah felt the old shame, the familiar feeling of being a pariah, rise like bile in her throat. The progress she had made, the peace she had found, felt like a fragile illusion. For a moment, she was back in Missouri, the subject of whispers, a fallen woman with no place to go. But then she felt a shift inside her. She was no longer that girl. She had faced down fire and fear. She had been seen, truly seen, by a man whose opinion mattered more than that of all these pinched, narrow-minded women combined. She turned from the counter to face Mrs. Gable, her expression not angry, but calm and level. "You are right, ma'am," Delilah said, her voice quiet but steady. "I do have a past, and I made a mistake that had terrible consequences." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But Mr. McAllister is a man who believes that a person is more than the worst thing they have ever done. I feel nothing but pity for those who cannot do the same." She placed her payment on the counter, gave Mr. Henderson a small, grateful nod, and walked out of the store, her back straight, leaving a stunned, indignant silence in her wake. The rumors, however, continued to fester. She was a fugitive from the law. She was a card-sharp's accomplice. She was a woman of loose morals who had somehow bewitched the stoic, solitary Boone McAllister. The story of her past became a canvas onto which the townspeople painted their own fears and prejudices. Boone was not deaf to the talk. He saw the way men in the saloon would stop talking when he entered. He saw the way their wives would steer their children to the other side of the street when Delilah was in town. He saw the shadow of it in Delilah's eyes, a quiet sadness she tried to hide, but that he, who was now fluent in the language of her silences, could read as clearly as a printed page, and he would not have it. He had spent his life hiding. After his mother's death, he had hidden his grief behind a wall of silence. He had hidden his loneliness behind the relentless work of the ranch. He had hidden from the community, from connection, from life itself. Delilah had coaxed him out of that hiding place, and he would be damned if he would let the world's ignorance force either of them back into the shadows. So he began to fight back in the only way he knew how. His defiance was as silent and unyielding as he was. When they rode to town in the wagon, he would insist she sit beside him on the buckboard, not in the back. He would place his hand on her elbow as he helped her down, a simple, proprietary gesture for all to see. In the general store, he would stand close beside her, his solid presence a clear and intimidating statement. His cold, unwavering gaze would fall on anyone who whispered or stared, and it was a rare man or woman who could hold that gaze for long. He was using his reputation, his formidable presence, not as a shield for himself, but as one for her. The rebuilding of the barn was completed just as the prairie burst into the full, glorious bloom of late spring. To celebrate the renewal and to thank the neighbors for their help, the town decided to expand its annual spring festival. It was to be the biggest gathering Dust Pine had ever seen, a symbol of the community's resilience. Delilah had dreaded it. The thought of facing the entire town, of being the central object of so much gossip and speculation, filled her with anxiety. "We don't have to go," Boone had said to her the night before, seeing the worry in her face. "Yes, we do," she had replied, her voice firm. "You have to thank everyone for their help, and we can't spend the rest of our lives hiding." She had used his own unspoken philosophy against him, and he had looked at her with a deep, approving pride. The day of the festival was bright and warm. The main street of Dust Pine was closed to wagons and filled with long trestle tables laden with food. The sounds of laughter and a lively string band filled the air. When Boone and Delilah arrived, a familiar pattern repeated itself. A hush fell. The stares followed them as they walked through the crowd. But this time, Delilah did not flinch. She kept her arm linked through Boone's, her head held high, her calm expression a perfect match for his own stoic demeanor. They were a united front, an island of quiet strength in a sea of speculation. Toward the end of the afternoon, the town mayor, a stout, florid man named Abernathy, climbed onto a makeshift stage erected in front of the saloon. He gave a long-winded speech, thanking the Lord for the end of a hard winter and praising the pioneer spirit that had seen them through the recent troubles. He thanked all the neighbors by name for their contributions to the rebuilding of the Red Mesa barn. And finally, he boomed, "I'd like to invite the man himself, a man of few words but mighty deeds, to say a thank you of his own, Mr. Boone McAllister." A polite, scattered applause went through the crowd. Delilah's heart sank. She knew Boone would never go up there. He hated being the center of attention. He would simply give a curt nod from where he stood. But then, to her utter astonishment, Boone squeezed her hand. "Let go," and began to walk toward the stage. A new kind of silence fell over the crowd, a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Boone McAllister, who had never so much as offered a public toast in his life, was climbing the steps to the stage. He walked to the center, his sling a stark reminder of the night of the fire, and stood for a moment. his gaze sweeping over the sea of upturned, incredulous faces. He looked uncomfortable, out of his element, but there was a powerful resolve in his stance. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was clear and carried in the sudden stillness. "Mayor Abernathy is right about one thing," Boone began, his voice a low, rough baritone. "I am a man of few words, so I'll be brief." He paused, and Delilah could feel the entire town leaning in, hanging on his next words. "I want to thank all of you, my neighbors. You came when I needed you, and you helped me rebuild. Red Mesa is in your debt." He gave a short, decisive nod. "But that's not the main reason I'm up here." His eyes scanned the crowd, searching until they found Delilah. He looked directly at her, and in that moment, it felt as if they were the only two people there. The rest of the town, the whole world, seemed to fade away. "Most of you know I lost my mother some years back," he said, his voice becoming quieter, more personal. "And I think a part of me was lost with her. I locked the doors to my own house. I let the silence in. I did the work. I ran the ranch, but I wasn't really living. I didn't much believe in myself, or in anything else, anymore." He took a deep breath, the public confession of his own private grief a shocking, vulnerable thing. "And then she came," he said, his gaze still locked on Delilah, his voice thick with an emotion he did not bother to hide. "And I'm not standing here to thank her for the stew she keeps on the stove, or for the stitches she puts in our torn shirts, though I am grateful for those things." He paused, letting the weight of his next words gather. "I'm standing here to thank her because she dared to believe in me when I no longer believed in myself. She walked into my silent house and wasn't afraid of the quiet. She saw the man I was, under all the dust and the grief, and she had the courage to stay. She reminded me that a home is more than just wood and stone, and that a man is more than his own sorrow." He finally broke his gaze from Delilah and looked out at the stunned faces of his community. "You whisper about her past, but I'm here to tell you about her character, her courage, her truth. She is the reason Red Mesa was worth rebuilding. She is the one who saved me." He finished, his chest heaving with the effort of laying his soul so bare. The silence that followed was absolute, a moment of collective, breathless understanding. The townspeople looked from Boone's raw, honest face to Delilah's, where tears were streaming freely, silently, down her cheeks. They had come to the festival expecting gossip and speculation. They had been given, instead, a powerful, undeniable truth. They had seen not a fallen woman and her keeper, but two strong, wounded people who had found a way to heal each other. It was Mrs. Gable, the woman from the general store, who started it. Her perpetually pinched face seemed to soften, to crumble, and she brought her hands together in a single, sharp clap. Then the mayor started clapping, then Silas and the hands, and then the entire town erupted in a roar of applause. It was not the scattered, polite applause he had received before. This was a wave of deep, heartfelt, thunderous approval. It was no longer hesitant. It was a sound of full-throated acceptance, a sound that washed away all the whispers and the prejudice and the doubt. It was the sound of a community choosing understanding over judgment. The roar of the applause at the spring festival faded, but its warmth lingered. A gentle, persistent heat that settled over Red Mesa and the town of Dustpine. In the days and weeks that followed, Delilah felt a profound and quiet shift in the world around her. The whispers in town did not vanish entirely. Prejudice, she learned, was a stubborn weed, but they lost their venom. The stares of judgment were replaced by nods of acknowledgement, and occasionally, a hesitant, respectful smile. Boone's words had not just defended her, they had redefined her. He had taken their shared story, a tale of fire and fear, and turned it into a testament of courage and redemption. Life on the ranch settled into a new, deeper rhythm. The rebuilt barn stood proud and strong against the sky. The fresh pines sent a constant reminder of renewal. The hands, who had always been kind, now treated her with a fierce, protective loyalty. She was no longer just the woman who cooked their meals and mended their shirts. She was the woman who had stood with their boss in the heart of the fire, the woman who had, in her own way, saved them all. But the most significant change was in the quiet spaces she shared with Boone. The wall of his grief and silence, already breached, had crumbled completely. He still wasn't a man of many words, but the words he chose now were different. He would tell her small things about his day: a stubborn calf, a shift in the weather, a patch of wildflowers he'd seen on the high ridge. He would ask for her opinion on the planting of the kitchen garden, his deference to her knowledge a quiet admission of their partnership. In the evenings, he would read from the newspaper aloud, his low voice a comforting rumble in the quiet house, and he would look to her for her thoughts on the news from back east. The house itself seemed to breathe again. Laughter, once a foreign sound within its walls, became a more frequent visitor. Delilah's own quiet joy began to bloom, and sometimes, over a shared meal or a quiet joke from Jedediah, Boone's rare, slow smile would appear, a sight that still made her heart catch in her throat. He was still her employer, and she was still his housekeeper. But the unspoken truth was that they had become something else entirely. They were the twin pillars that held up the roof of this home, two solitary souls who had found their anchor in each other. It was on a late afternoon in the full flush of summer that the final, unspoken question between them was answered. The day had been long and warm, and a gentle breeze, carrying the sweet scent of clover and sun-baked earth, drifted through the open kitchen window. The ranch was quiet, the hands still out on the range, the work of the day winding down. Delilah was alone in her kitchen, a space that felt more hers than any place on earth. The last of the supper dishes were washed and put away, and a loaf of bread for the morning was rising under a clean linen cloth on the counter. The low, golden light of the setting sun streamed through the window, illuminating the familiar, comforting details of the room: the gleam of the well-seasoned cast-iron pans, the vibrant green of the herbs in her window box, the worn, smooth surface of the wooden work table. She was standing at the table, a soft cloth in her hand, polishing the small, tarnished silver spoon she had found months ago. "Eleonora." She no longer felt like an intruder when she touched the spoon. She felt like a keeper of the memory, a link in a chain of strong women who had made this harsh land their home. She was polishing away the last vestiges of tarnish, her movements slow and meditative, when a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up, a soft smile already on her lips, expecting to see him ready for his supper. Boone stood there, but he was not in his dusty work clothes. He had washed and changed into a clean shirt. His hair was still damp. He was not looking at her, but at the small, intricately carved wooden box he held in his large, calloused hands. It was made of pale pine, its surface sanded smooth, and it looked very small and fragile in his grasp. He stepped into the kitchen, his boots making a soft, hesitant sound on the clean floorboards. He stopped a few feet from the table, and the quiet, comfortable atmosphere of the room suddenly felt charged, thick with an unspoken, momentous weight. He cleared his throat and finally raised his eyes to meet hers. They were filled with a nervousness she had only seen once before, the night he had asked her to the dance. "I was in the old workshop today," he began, his voice low and a little rough. "My father, he used to whittle. In the evenings, made boxes like this." He looked down at the pine box again, as if gathering his courage from the feel of the wood. "I don't have a ring," he said, the words blunt and honest and so perfectly him that it made her heart ache. He looked up at her again, his gaze direct and full of a raw, hopeful vulnerability. "I don't have the things a town man might offer. No fancy promises, just this." He stepped forward and placed the small pine box on the table beside her polishing cloth. It sat there between them, a simple, unadorned offering. He didn't open it. "But this," he continued, his voice softer now, "is the key to the granary. Delilah stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the meaning behind his words. The key to the granary. It was not a piece of jewelry. It was not a symbol of romance. It was a symbol of everything. The granary held the seed for the next season's planting, the fruits of the last harvest. It was the heart of the ranch's wealth, the key to its survival, the promise of its future. To give someone that key was an act of absolute, unconditional trust. It was to make them a partner in every sunrise, every season, every success, and every failure. She looked from the box to his face, at the earnest, hopeful question in his eyes. Her own lips parted, but no sound came out at first. "Is that," she finally whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "a proposal?" Boone gave a single, slow nod, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's an invitation," he clarified, his words careful, deliberate, giving her all the power. An invitation to stay, to make this your home, not just your place of work, to build a life here, if you want. If she wanted, after everything she had been through, after a lifetime of having her choices made for her by circumstance and the cruelty of others, he was offering her the most important choice of all. He was not demanding, not assuming. He was asking. He was inviting her to choose him, to choose this life, freely and with her whole heart. The weight of the moment, the sheer, staggering beauty of his offer, was overwhelming. A slow smile touched her lips, a smile that wobbled with the force of the emotions swelling inside her. The past and the present collided, and she found the only words that could truly capture the incredible, improbable journey that had brought them to this sun-drenched kitchen. "Another bad choice, isn't it?" she asked, her voice a soft, playful whisper. It was their language, a secret code of shared history and mutual redemption. It was an acknowledgement of all the risks, all the pain, and all the reasons the world might have said they were wrong for each other. He closed the distance between them, his movement as certain and sure as his feelings. He reached out, his calloused hand so gentle as he cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. The smile that touched his lips was the one she had come to cherish, the slow, rare smile that lit his eyes from within. "Hope," he said, his voice a low, profound rumble, "is a choice that's never wrong." She looked up at him, at the truth and the promise in his eyes, and felt the last of her old fears melt away like snow in the spring sun. She had been a woman who made bad choices, but standing here, in the arms of this good, strong man, she knew she was about to make the best one of her life. She didn't answer him with words. She didn't need to. She simply leaned into his touch, her gaze dropping to the small pine box on the table. She reached out with a steady hand and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was not a ring, but a single, heavy, ornate iron key. She tilted her head, a silent question and 1,000 silent answers in the gesture. And then, as the last rays of the setting sun filled the room with a warm, golden promise, Delilah Hart bit her lip. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also support us by hitting the hype button. We appreciate every one of you.